It is the 27th of May, 1944, and from 3,000 feet above the Kent coastline, a German reconnaissance pilot is looking down at the largest invasion fleet he has ever seen. Rows of Sherman tanks sit parked beneath camouflage netting near Dover. Landing craft, dozens of them, crowd the mouth of the Thames Estuary. Lorries queue along country lanes that were quiet farm tracks only weeks before. Wireless traffic crackles across the airwaves, the chatter of an entire army group preparing to cross the channel at its narrowest point. Every photograph this pilot takes, every report he files when he lands, will tell his superiors in Berlin exactly what they already expect to hear. The Allies are massing in the southeast. The blow will fall at Calais. None of it is real. The tanks are rubber, inflated with bicycle pumps and steadied with timber frames. The landing craft are floating shells of canvas and scaffolding, bobbing on oil drums in the tide. The lorries are painted plywood on a tubular skeleton, light enough for 2 men to lift. The wireless traffic is being broadcast by a handful of signals operators standing in for tens of thousands of soldiers who do not exist. Somewhere southwest of all this theater, in Hampshire and Dorset and Devon, the real invasion force is gathering in near silence, hidden not by distance but by the sheer scale of the lie being told 80 miles to the east. This is the story of Operation Fortitude, and of the strange, improvised, almost theatrical industry that Britain built to support it. An army of dummies, an air force of plywood, a navy of canvas and rust, all designed to do one thing: convince Adolf Hitler that the largest amphibious invasion in human history was happening somewhere it was not. What makes this story remarkable is not simply that the deception worked. It is that it worked using materials a village hall pantomime might have recognized, built by people whose day jobs only months earlier had been painting scenery and dressing shop windows. By the spring of 1944, the Allies faced a problem that no amount of manpower could solve on its own. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, would commit roughly 156,000 troops to the beaches on the first day alone, supported by nearly 7,000 vessels. It was, by any measure, an enormous undertaking, but size was also the problem. An invasion fleet of that scale cannot simply appear on a given morning. The buildup takes months, and a buildup of that magnitude is almost impossible to hide from an enemy with aircraft, agents, and a coastline only 21 miles away from the nearest English shore at its closest point. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They did not know precisely when, and crucially, they did not know precisely where. From their perspective, 2 principal possibilities presented themselves. Pas de Calais offered the shortest sea crossing, better port facilities, and the most direct route towards Germany itself. Normandy was further away, its beaches less obviously suited to a major assault, and therefore, to German planners, a less likely target. This single assumption became the foundation on which an entire deception had to be built. The stakes could scarcely have been higher. If German intelligence correctly identified Normandy as the target and redirected the formidable 15th Army, stationed in the Pas de Calais region with its panzer divisions held in reserve, the consequences for the men landing on those beaches would have been catastrophic. Military historians have long argued that the Normandy landing succeeded not simply because of what happened on the beaches themselves, but because of what did not happen behind them. The German High Command kept entire armies waiting for an invasion that would never come, for weeks after the real one had already begun. Conventional secrecy could not achieve this. You cannot hide 156,000 men and their equipment by telling nobody where they are. What you can do, however, is give the enemy something else to look at, something that fits the story they already believe. This was the insight at the heart of Operation Fortitude, and indeed of the wider deception program that contained it, Operation Bodyguard. Rather than trying to conceal the invasion, the planners decided to manufacture a second, fictional one, and place it precisely where the Germans expected the real thing to land. The challenge then became practical rather than purely strategic. How do you build an army that does not exist? How do you make it visible enough to be photographed from the air, convincing enough to survive scrutiny by trained intelligence analysts, and flexible enough to be packed away and moved at a moment's notice, all while the real war effort consumed almost every scrap of steel, rubber, and skilled labor Britain possessed? The answer required not tank designers or naval architects, but people skilled in an entirely different trade: the illusion of scale, learned not on a battlefield but in a theater workshop. The organization tasked with solving this problem was a deliberately obscure unit known as A-Force, working alongside the London Controlling Section, the body coordinating Allied deception strategy across every theater of the war. But the practical work of building a fake army fell to camoufleurs, set designers and engineers drawn from some distinctly unmilitary backgrounds. Many had worked in film studios or West End theater production before the war. Their skills in creating convincing illusions from limited materials, learned building stage sets rather than military hardware, turned out to translate remarkably well. The most ambitious physical deceptions were the dummy landing craft, codenamed Big Bobs. Hundreds of these were constructed and positioned along the Thames Estuary and other harbors in eastern England, in plain sight of any reconnaissance aircraft that managed to overfly the coast. Each Big Bob was built from a frame of scaffolding poles and canvas sheeting, stretched over a buoyant base, often using stacks of 45-gallon oil drums lashed together to keep the structure afloat. From the ground, or the water, the illusion would not have survived close inspection. From 3,000 feet, photographed at speed through a camera lens with the texture and shadow that morning or evening light provides, a Big Bob looked very much like a tank landing craft waiting for its cargo. Sitting alongside the dummy fleet were dummy vehicles built using broadly similar logic: wooden frames, canvas or painted plywood skins, and a deliberate attention to the small details that aerial photography would pick up: the angle of a gun barrel, the regular spacing of vehicles in a depot, tire tracks worn into the grass by tractors towing the dummies into position. Some accounts from earlier deception operations in North Africa describe inflatable tanks built around a network of rubber tubes, a kind of pneumatic skeleton beneath a fabric skin, an approach that had already proven effective at fooling German reconnaissance over the desert in 1942. Whether inflatable tanks of this type featured heavily in the Southeast England deployments for Fortitude itself remains genuinely disputed among historians. What is well documented is the broader program of wood, canvas, and sheet metal dummies that populated the fake camps alongside the Big Bobs in the estuaries. Weight was everything. A genuine 3-ton lorry could not be casually relocated by 2 men whenever the deception required a different arrangement to be photographed the following week. A dummy vehicle needed to be light enough to lift, sturdy enough to survive an English spring, and convincing enough that a trained German photo interpreter, working from grainy reconnaissance film, would see exactly what the broader deception had primed him to expect. The genius of the scheme lay less in any single piece of equipment and more in the accumulation of small, mutually reinforcing details: dummy vehicles parked beside real supply dumps, fake wireless traffic referencing genuine geographic features, double agents feeding information that lined up neatly with what the aerial photographs seemed to confirm. Consider what a convincing dummy actually required. A real Sherman tank weighed around 30 tons, low and angular, painted in patterns designed to break up its silhouette from the air. A dummy version needed none of that armor, none of that engine, none of the tracks that gave the real machine its menace on the ground. What it needed was a profile that matched, viewed from above at the altitude and angle a reconnaissance camera would typically capture. Wooden battens and scaffold tube formed the skeleton. Canvas or painted hessian, stretched taut and weatherproofed, formed the skin. Shadows mattered as much as shape, so the height of the structure and the angle of its edges were calculated to throw the same kind of shadow a real tank would cast at a given time of day, a detail that separated an amateur prop from one that would survive the scrutiny of a trained interpreter studying stereoscopic photographs back at an analysis unit. The work of building all this fell to units with deliberately unglamorous names, camouflage and deception companies attached to the Royal Engineers, working from depots and country estates requisitioned for the purpose. Set designers and scenic artists who had spent the years before the war building backdrops for West End productions found themselves applying exactly the same trade to a rather more consequential audience. The skills translated directly: how to suggest mass and weight using the lightest possible materials, how to use paint and shadow to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface, how to make something look used, weathered, and lived in rather than freshly built. Where a stage designer might once have built a castle wall from painted canvas to fool an audience seated 30 feet away, the same techniques now had to fool a camera lens several thousand feet up, photographing at oblique angles in changeable English weather. Sound formed a smaller, but not insignificant, part of the picture, particularly once the Americans expanded on the British approach. Recordings of tank engines, marching boots, and radio chatter, played through powerful amplifiers, could project the impression of an armored column to listeners many kilometers away in the still of night, a deception that relied on the simple fact that sound, like light, can be made to suggest a scale that does not physically exist. None of this required exotic engineering, a loudspeaker of the kind used in cinemas, a wax or acetate recording made under controlled conditions back in the United States, and a few hundred watts of amplification were sufficient to convince a listening post, in the dark, that a division was on the move. Production of the visual decoys was necessarily improvised rather than industrial. There was no single factory turning out thousands of identical dummy tanks to a fixed specification, in the way that the Vauxhall Works in Luton turned out genuine Churchill tanks by the hundred. Instead, small teams worked from country house workshops and Royal Engineer depots scattered across Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia, building to a common design but adapting materials to whatever was available, a fact that makes precise production figures difficult to establish with confidence. Surviving records suggest hundreds of dummy vehicles and landing craft were built and positioned for the southeastern deception alone, though exact totals remain incomplete, partly because so much of the original planning material stayed classified for decades, and partly because so little of the equipment itself was ever expected to survive long enough to be properly catalogued. This was deception engineered for an audience that wanted to believe a particular story. German intelligence had already concluded that Calais was the logical target. Fortitude did not need to convince a skeptic. It needed to give a believer enough supporting evidence to ignore everything else. The wireless deception ran in parallel with the physical one, and arguably mattered more. Operators stationed across the southeast generated the radio traffic of an entire Army group, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a formation that existed only on paper and in the German intercepts that tracked its supposed movements. Convoy reports, supply requests, training exercises, all simulated, all designed to be intercepted. The choice of commander for this phantom force was itself a piece of theater. General George S. Patton, a man whose reputation for aggression German planners respected and feared, was placed nominally in charge of FUSAG. The logic ran that the Allies would surely commit their most formidable commander to the primary invasion force, not to a diversion, and German intelligence appears to have reasoned exactly that way. The deception extended on to the night of the invasion itself. Operations Taxable and Glimmer, conducted in the early hours of June 6, 1944, used small boats towing radar-reflective balloons, combined with aircraft dropping foil strips known as window, to simulate the radar signature of a large naval convoy approaching Cap d'Antifer and the Pas de Calais respectively, neither of which was the actual landing site. German radar operators that night reported convoys advancing through the channel that were never there at all. Picture the scene from the German side of the radar screen that night. A duty officer at a coastal station watches a formation of blips crawl steadily across his display at the speed of a naval convoy, precisely where doctrine told him to expect the invasion fleet, exactly as weeks of aerial photography over Kent had led him to anticipate. He would have had no reason to doubt what he was seeing. The blips behaved like ships because the operation had been engineered, minute by minute, to make them behave like ships. The small boats holding formation, the aircraft circling at the correct intervals to refresh the radar picture, the whole performance choreographed to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny a skeptical operator might apply. Coastal batteries that opened fire that night were firing at an illusion built from balloons, foil, and a handful of motor launches crewed by men who knew that drawing German attention toward themselves, rather than toward the real beaches further west, was the entire point of the exercise. Documentation of how individual German units reacted, hour by hour, to the broader deception remains patchy. Much of what historians can say with confidence comes from post-war interrogation of German officers and from the small number of wartime intercepts that survived, rather than from a complete operational record. What is reasonably well established is that German coastal radar and observation posts along the Pas de Calais sector reported activity consistent with an imminent landing, and that this reporting arrived at a moment when German planners were already primed, by months of aerial photography and double-agent reporting, to interpret exactly that kind of activity as confirmation of their existing assumptions. Where speculation creeps in is in weighing how much any single element, the big bobs, the dummy tanks, the wireless traffic, or the radar deception on the night itself, contributed compared to the others. The honest answer, supported by most serious historical accounts, is that no single piece did the work alone. The deception succeeded because every channel of German intelligence told a consistent story at once. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans had their own deception efforts, though arguably nothing on the scale or sophistication of Fortitude. German camouflage and decoy units had used dummy tanks for training and limited tactical deception since before the war, and false targets and decoy positions appeared on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. What German deception efforts largely lacked, however, was the layered, theater-wide coordination that characterized the British approach, the combination of physical decoys, fabricated radio traffic, double agents, and diplomatic misdirection, all telling a single consistent story to multiple independent channels of German intelligence at once. The Americans, for their part, embraced and expanded the concept after seeing it demonstrated in the European theater. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later known as the Ghost Army, took the British template and pushed it further still, fielding inflatable tanks, sonic deception using powerful amplifiers capable of projecting the recorded sound of armored columns across 20 kilometers, and a traveling repertoire of more than 20 staged deceptions across France and Germany through to the war's final months. Where the British innovation had been largely static, built to support one specific invasion, the American Ghost Army made deception mobile, a unit that could roll into a sector, stage an illusion of overwhelming force, and roll out again before the enemy worked out what had happened. Assessing the precise impact of Fortitude with certainty is, by its nature, difficult. Deception does not leave the kind of physical evidence a tank battle does. What can be said with confidence is that the German 15th Army, stationed in the Pas de Calais sector with substantial armored reserves, remained largely in place for weeks after the Normandy landings began, even as Allied forces fought to expand their foothold and the outcome of the invasion hung in the balance. Adolf Hitler himself reportedly continued to believe, for some time after June 6th, that Normandy represented a feint, and that the main assault on Calais was still to come. Whether this conviction stemmed primarily from Fortitude or from Hitler's own pre-existing assumptions is a question historians continue to debate, and it would be dishonest to claim the deception alone determined the outcome. What is reasonably well supported is that Fortitude reinforced conclusions the German High Command was already inclined to reach, and in doing so, helped ensure those conclusions held firm for longer than they otherwise might have. The legacy of this strange, improvised industry outlived the war by decades. Military deception became a formal discipline within NATO planning, and the broad principle pioneered in the fields of Kent that an enemy primed to expect one story will often supply the missing details himself has informed deception doctrine ever since. Surviving examples of the dummy equipment are scarce. Most were dismantled, scrapped, or simply rotted away once their purpose had been served, leaving museums and private collections with only photographs, a handful of preserved frames, and the declassified planning documents that were not released to the public until decades after the guns fell silent. Return, for a moment, to that German reconnaissance pilot above Kent in May 1944. He photographs what he believes to be tanks. He photographs what he believes to be an invasion fleet, gathering strength by the day. He files his report, and his report tells Berlin precisely what Berlin wants to hear, and the wanting, in the end, may have mattered more than anything built of canvas or rubber or plywood.